Everybody, and welcome to our first talk in the History Talks live series for the year 2022 to 23. I'm Ian Robertson. I'm Associate Professor of Historical Geography here at the Centre for History, and it's my great pleasure to welcome Professor David Worthington to give this evening's talk and to indeed open our season. David is Professor of History and long-standing head of the Centre for History here in Dornoch, and he is a historian of Scotland's connections with Central Europe in the early modern period, or of the early modern period. David's published widely around this topic. With his latest monograph, and I swear he specialises in long titles, his latest monograph being Reverend James Fraser, 1634 to 1709, A New Perspective on the Scottish Highlands before Culloden. And that monograph, that wonderful publication, is due to be published by Edinburgh University Press next year, 2023. So fantastic. Now, David has obviously had a long-standing interest in this gentleman, the Reverend James Fraser, and that is, of course, the focus of tonight's talk, which itself draws on an article he published in the Renaissance Studies Journal earlier this year. Tonight, then, David is speaking on, spoiler alert, another long title, The Multilingual Minister, Languages in the Life Writing of Scottish Highland.
Thank you, Ian. Thank you to everybody for coming along. Hopefully you can hear me okay, and I'll get going. In the 16th and 17th centuries, the North Sea was a transnational space characterised by what has been called extensive oral semi-communication. This was an interchange between speakers of the various Germanic languages and sometimes French, one where scholars also continued to read each other's works and sometimes write to each other in Latin. As a whole, it surely compares with what Eric Durstiller has recognised in his work on the Mediterranean as, quote, a more linguistically ambiguous and complex reality, unquote, than usually considered. A less sun-drenched, rather grey, but multilingual North Sea mosaic and ecotone that has been, quote, obscured by the anachronistic imposition of modern monolingualism onto the past. While Durstiller brings in French, Dutch and Danish examples to compare with its Mediterranean core, and John Gallagher has opened historians up to new perspectives on England and the English in the North Sea, Northern Scottish linguistic evidence from the period has yet to be encompassed in the nascent debate about the German Ocean or North Sea, with Thomas Brochard's work an early indicator of what could be done. First slide, please, Nicola. To be multilingual was not unusual in the Firth lands of northern mainland Scotland, from where Reverend James Fraser came. Can you show the next 2 or 3 slides, please, just in succession? As shall be shown, it was a location where 3 languages, Scots Gaelic, Scots, and increasingly English, had everyday functions. The early modern Firth lands also evidenced a degree of national and international mobility for military, socio-economic, or cultural reasons. Its 3 major tongues aside, Fraser's home locale was a place with a strong linguistic connection to the Norse world, one in which during the 17th century, for a few, French, Dutch, and Low German were also becoming fashionable and of practical benefit. Some were even accustomed to a relatively high level of education in Latin, and to a lesser extent, also in Greek and Hebrew. Hence, there was a Scottish Highland involvement in a babel of tongues linking across the grey, briny sea to Europe, and sometimes from there to empire. My talk will show the Firth lands' interplay in both speech and writing, and through the example of Fraser. I hope open historians to new lines of inquiry regarding the use of languages around North Sea-facing littorals during the period. To assume Scottish Highland scholarship, linguistic or otherwise, in the century before the Battle of Culloden in 1746 to be disengaged would be simplistic and misguided. A more appropriate approach would contrast the 17th century Highlands being treated by authorities in Edinburgh and London as uncivil, liable to savagery and barbarism, with paradoxically the agency of its scholars in terms of how they engaged with and became entangled in worlds beyond. We would be wrong to assume that Gaelic, Scots and English and ancient languages, for those who went to grammar school and university, were the limit for the Lovett-Fraser household to which James Fraser belonged, the clan fitting the broader points made already about the Firthlands. Next slide, please. The possibility of significant exposure to other tongues is suggested in the remarkable case of Colonel Hugh Fraser, who died in 1649 as a veteran of the 30 Years' War. In later life, James Fraser, who I'm going to talk about, tells us he reverted not to his native Gaelic or Scots, but to High Dutch or Slavonic, when nearing the end of his life back by the Beauly Firth, presumably drawing on military experiences in Germany, as well as in Poland or Bohemia. Taking this into account, this talk will employ James Fraser's two lengthiest surviving texts, the Wardlaw manuscript, which is a history of the Frasers to 1674, and their triennial travels, his memoir of his unique tour of Europe from 1657 to 60. Both of these were intended for a much wider, albeit undefined audience. Using these examples of his life writing, I will hope to reveal considerable code switching, which the OED, Oxford English Dictionary, defines as the ability on the part of bilinguals to alternate effortlessly between their two languages, and polyglossia, which they define as the coexistence of two or more languages or distinct varieties of the same language within a speech community. So Fraser's code switching and polyglossia had their origins at home, but were also influenced significantly by what he experienced on his journey through continental Europe. So the first part of my talk, I'll talk about spoken language and orality in his accounts. And in the second part, I'll focus on the languages James Fraser wrote and read in. Both will reveal multilingual and a multilingual aspect as a defining feature, although show how this took on different shades depending on the setting. Okay, so the spoken word first. Although advances have been made in the social history of language, as Peter Burke put it in 1993, his assertion that scholars remained a long way from establishing an historical ethnography of speaking continues to be pertinent. James Fraser probably uttered his first words in Scots Gaelic, this followed by him acquiring a speaking knowledge of the Scots and then English languages. In addition, he had to communicate in Latin, as well as for religious purposes, read some Greek and some Hebrew as an adolescent pupil and student, while his travel memoirs record his determination as a young adult, before he became a minister, to attain verbal dexterity in French, Spanish, Italian, German, Slavonic, Hungarian, Bohemian, and Dutch. One can get a sense of him inhabiting a complex oral environment in the way that he records language, whether at home in his parish of Kirkhill, at grammar school in nearby Inverness, university in Aberdeen, or on his travels. Next slide, please. Okay. We see an example of an everyday Scots Gaelic and Scots interchange in Fraser's Kirkhill, in the example of a rather macabre story, which I'm going to relate now. Fraser tells us about a brother-in-law of his, an individual whose Gaelic name he denotes in partially anglicised form as John MacIaneir, John, son of John. In the early 1670s, there occurred an argument between MacIaneir and two other parishioners, a John McKeon Vore, John, son of Big John, and a Donald McWilliam Huey, Donald, son of Black William. So we see Gaelic-speaking parishioners. The latter, household servants, not wash away the blood. And the Kirkhill community soon found his body and identified him. The community suspected MacIaneir to be the murderer, and rumours spread that he'd fled inland and southeast, as far as Strathspey, several parishes beyond. 2 years on, James Fraser, having travelled eastwards from Kirkhill to attend the Synod of Murray, of which his parish and presbytery were a part, described the suspect's circumstances and appearance to fellow Synod member Sir James Strachan of Thornton. The latter revealed that he knew MacIaneir and said, he was living under separate pseudonyms as a Donald Gaelic or Highland Donald, and in these guises he was serving a William Fraser of Cooperhill near the Bridge of Keith, which was on the eastern fringes of the Synod of Murray, a massive administrative area, but a very significant one. Consequent to Reverend Fraser revealing this back in Kirkhill, Lord Lovat, his clan chief, quote, sent away a country boy that had both languages to Keith with a line to Cooper Hill, who presented Highland Donald openly to his view, unquote. Lovat then travelled to Keith himself with 6 or 7 men to lay a trap for the suspect, and being taken back to Inverness, McKean confessed and was imprisoned. According to Fraser, the fate of both he and McKean Vore was eventually to be executed, and the right arms of each displayed on poles below the church at Kirkhill. So you'll see why, as I study James Fraser, he becomes less appealing. Turning to Gaelic first, my own limitations as a learner of the language must be acknowledged here, and I greatly appreciate all sorts of expertise in this area. However, as is suggested from the naming practices above, Kirkhill was clearly a majority Gaelic-speaking community, a parish that sat in the Inverness Presbytery and on the western edge of the sprawling, heterogeneous Diocese of Murray. Fraser did not, as minister after 1661, subscribe to the earlier expressed government policy, supported by some local dynasties, of subduing the language. However, it's vital to ask what type of Gaelic he used and encouraged there, both before and after he entered the ministry. So, without going over a debate that is very important, but which we don't have time to discuss, there are 2 forms to consider. Classical Common Gaelic, once a language of writing and recital, common to both Scottish and Irish Gaeldom, but in retreat by Fraser's lifetime, and vernacular Scots Gaelic. Debate tends to focus on the written forms, understandably. It's hard to do oral histories for the 17th century. Moreover, confusingly for modern readers, Fraser followed the contemporary norms of Scots and English writing by referring to both Irish and Scots Gaelic as Irish. John Fraser, an early 20th century Scots Gaelic scholar, commented on what he called a considerable number of Gaelic words and phrases, proverbs, fragments of verse, and more, written in a phonetic spelling in Fraser's Word Law manuscript, considering it to provide, quote, some of the earliest, if not the very earliest, dated evidence for the pronunciation of Gaelic in the Northern Highlands, a point that's been disputed recently by Martin McGregor. James Fraser does suggest frequently that he took a particular interest in communicating in the local forms of the tongue. He provides us with compelling evidence that it was an everyday language, but not the sole one in the Lovat Fraser lands. On the death of an earlier Lord Lovat in 1576, Fraser claims that the chief's foster brother proclaimed his mourning, quote, in his own vernacular language. Fraser also details how lowland Scots-speaking women marrying into this world and bringing large dowries could experience life differently if they didn't possess the ability to speak the majority tongue. On one hand, 1633, Lord Hugh Fraser, the 7th Lord Lovat's good lady, Isabel Weems, was, quote, much in fancy with that country, Strath-Eric in this case, and though she wanted the language, yet gained the love and respect of all that knew her there and elsewhere, unquote. On the other hand, when in Sutherland, Dame Catherine Ross, Lady Moynihan, widow of the 6th Lord Lovat, met with Donald Blasha, Donald of Strathglass, quote, a common servant about the house, who accosted Lady Catherine, checking her severely for her wilfulness, speaking in Irish to her, having no other language. Catherine, you are unwise. This warning was issued in relation to her proposed marital partner and involved Donald pleading with Catherine that she marry someone else instead. We have to assume she was either fluent enough to pick up the gist of his Gaelic admonition or had it translated to her, albeit the lack of common language appears to have caused tensions. James Fraser's recounting of place names is equally suggestive of the preponderance of a North Highland form of Gaelic, revealing more toponymy in that form than exists today. In the Word Law manuscript, he provides these in a Scots or English orthography, and yet in a vernacular version, sometimes favouring this over other linguistic forms that might be more accessible. If you know Kirkhill, it's also known as Ward Law, and that means the Watch Hill. And Fraser doesn't refer to it as either Ward Law or Kirkhill. He calls it Mons Mariae in Latin, Mary's Hill. And that, in fact, corresponds with its medieval Gaelic version, Crochvuida, a reference to the medieval church there devoted to Mary. So that's an intriguing choice. Other Scots Gaelic toponyms he references without translating, are recognisable to those today without the language. Next slide, please. Thank you. So, Fraser clearly communicated in Scots Gaelic, and indeed its local versions, and was reliant on it when presenting his immediate physical and natural surroundings to his readers, even his social surroundings. However, the dark anecdote about MacIan Ear and MacIan Vor reveals also the deliberate mixing of Scots language naming practices with Gaelic ones, the creation of pseudonyms, tricksterism, dissimulation, and identity concealment across the Diocese of Murray that I think Natalie's even Davis would love. The story highlights how the Moravian religious, therefore social and administrative world in which Fraser worked was a place where neither all Scots Gaelic speakers knew Scots, nor all Scots speakers knew Scots Gaelic, but where frontiers of speech could be negotiated or even manipulated, and where bilinguals or multilinguals had a key role. Fraser knew Scots. It's a language which is like English, but unlike Gaelic, of course, a Germanic tongue brought by Anglo-Saxons and Jutes, which was an established literary lingua franca at state level in later medieval Scotland. With the regal union between England, Scotland and Ireland in 1603, the pressures on it began to increase, although, for example, the Scottish Privy Council continued to function in Scots throughout Fraser's lifetime. Moreover, as a spoken language, it continued to be used throughout most of the Scottish lowlands, including in the boroughs of Forres and Elgin, places which Fraser frequented via his attendance as Synod of Murray. So, while in his two most substantial works, Fraser writes in something akin to a Scottish English, the approach he takes when translating from Scots is notable. In the Wardlaw manuscript, Fraser provides proverbs in a form of Scots that would have been easily intelligible to an Anglophone. One example he quotes is to turn the kirk to thack the cure, to strip the church to thatch the cleric. Great one. Another being, one devil is fittest to dig out another, one devil's fittest to knock out another. Fraser may have picked these phrases up orally as a child. His referencing of them suggests that, although his mother tongue was Gaelic, Scots influenced his speech throughout his life. And this is confirmed by local church records and those of his nearest royal borough, Inverness. Now to English. Because another key element in Fraser's versatility in spoken languages, that's maybe emerged already, is his use of them for secrecy, exclusivity, and disguise. English was arguably of the greatest relevance to him in this regard. While as a child, Fraser encountered the language daily as a written language through the Bible and other printed texts. It's quite possible he didn't learn to speak it until his later teens. It's been argued that the garrison established by Oliver Cromwell in the 1650s assisted in spoken English growing into it becoming the dominant linguistic culture in Inverness. Fraser's first expert, let's say, William Mackay, offered a different judgment in 1905, concluding that the reason for the relative clarity of Invernessian English was, quote, the language was acquired by a Gaelic-speaking people whose native tongue was remarkably free from brogue or accent. Indubitably, during Fraser's lifetime, English grew in significance as a language for speech in the Firthlands, with Nicholas Canny claiming that by the mid-century point, the ruling elite in all jurisdictions of the British Crown understood it. Now, Fraser's Britishness was negotiated and partial, but it would be too simplistic to argue that it was only the elites who spoke English outside England in the 17th century. Next slide, please. Fraser's versatility in spoken Gaelic, Scots and English remained evident while on his travels. In June 1657, he set off on an adventure of a remarkable type for a Highlander in the early modern period. According to his own account, his travels between then and early 1660 took him by horseback, boat and mostly foot across swathes of southern, central and western Europe. Fraser's initial route would introduce him to London, carry him across the English Channel to Dieppe, and now assuming the guise of a Catholic pilgrim, long story, more dissimulation, he's as slippery as a salmon. On to Marseille. Diverted by pirates to northeast Spain, he would head east via Corsica and then Genoa, choosing to extend his stay in Italy by spending nearly a year in Rome, besides taking in many of the peninsula's other major cities. From Venice, Fraser would venture through Alpine passes, heading eastwards through Bavaria, Austria, and northwestern Hungary, before making an abrupt turn to commence a westward route into Bohemia, Germany, and Low Countries, on to northern France, London, and eventually back home to the Highlands. Next slide, please. Now, on a handful of occasions in his triennial travels, he makes the claim that as a Highland Gael, he could communicate with Irish speakers. This is kind of controversial. He probably never met an Irish speaker from Ireland before. But one sees this claim of verbal engagement with Irish immigrants in a case from a monastery in Lyon, where he says, "We met with one Father Martin, an Irishman, a most discreet man, and finding that I could speak Irish, he doubled his kindness." Even more striking is an incident towards the end of his itinerary in the Spanish Netherlands, that's the Spanish Low Countries, where Fraser had his clothing bags and papers taken and checked by a body of local officials. Struggling to understand their Spanish speech and guessing at the Irish identity of one man within the group, the temporarily trouserless Fraser asserted that he greeted him in a form of Gaelic. The Irishman responded to Fraser, quote, "Astonishing all the rest to see him and me, so intimate, and speak a language which none of them could understand." And he responded to Fraser by basically saying, "I'll get your trousers back." The English language will be key to Fraser's travels beyond Scotland too. One assumes he experienced few problems in adapting to the startling range of accents and dialects that he must have heard for the first time in Inverness with the arrival of the Cromwellian soldiers. Indeed, his broader linguistic aptitude may have helped him ingratiate himself enough with the community there to receive his passport in 1657. Use of the language would be paramount in terms of his communication while moving through England and especially London, as the social circle began to extend for the first time to his countrymen, that was his word, from across all three Stuart kingdoms. The continent might have been expected to provide fewer opportunities to use it. Almost nobody knew English in continental Europe then. As John Gallagher has shown, it was the little known and little regarded language of a small island out on the edge of Europe. It wasn't even the language of some of that island or body of islands. This requiring all those who relied on it at home to become language learners whenever they headed across the North Sea. Having said that, the Dutch could be one exception to the continental indifference. Fraser talks about his encounter with a George Ratter in Padua, who he describes as Dutch. Says that he spoke good English, and on becoming well watered with him after sampling several sorts of wines, things went quite well. I won't recount his references to getting legless in Livorno, but I'll leave it to your imagination. English could provide access to the majority of a Stuart immigrant and exile community in continental Europe of tens of thousands. Among that body from the Stuart kingdoms who by then knew it as a first or second language, it became, once on the continent, a mode of speech allowing for community as well as confidentiality. Fraser didn't always rely on any of Gaelic, Scots or English while on his travels. On the contrary, at every juncture while on the continent, he sought to learn other tongues. And his written record of this, while weirdly derivative of that of Welsh royalist James Howell, far outweighs that of the typical grand tourist from the Stuart kingdoms. In 1678, Jean Gaillard, French Huguenot, published the first 2 volumes of his work, The Complete Gentleman, in which he asserted that language learning should be key. 20 years earlier, James Fraser was already taking this pragmatic approach. After boarding the Row of Rye, which took him to Dieppe, he was impressed by the skipper having good French. I'm going to murder my French now, so just beware. Watch out. He was impressed by the skipper having, quote, good French and drank the king's good health. Vive le roi d'Angleterre. Impressed. Thank you. Happy may the King of England live, Fraser provides us with a translation. Not only that, on disembarking in Dieppe Harbour, Fraser made clear his wish to, quote, learn a little of the French language to fit us for our journey. Indeed, in Dieppe, he found little difference save in the language. To an extent that exceeds that of lowland Scottish adventurers of the time, like William Lithgow, Patrick Gordon, Sir John Lauder of Fountain Hill, Fraser emphasises how linguistic aptitude was key for the traveller, especially in France, because language learning ensured success in France, not that any of us could relate to this. As to your converse, Fraser said, you are received but coldly in France without your language, which when you begin to express and distribute freely among them, you insinuate yourself mightily thereby, and by degrees conciliate their favour, and in time attain some kind of confidence. And they grow very communicable, and inform you readily of their customs. May they encourage you, so that if you can but call for anything intelligible, learned, they commend your language highly with a "Vous parlez bon français," you speak good French. Moving south, Fraser claims that his foray onto the Iberian Peninsula was an unintended consequence of his ship from Marseille being attacked by pirates. There's a story in that too. A setback which saw him disembark temporarily in Roses in Catalonia. Once again, though, he's drawn to collect key phrases and comment on the languages he heard. His remarks were no longer reserved for national languages, but display an openness to regional tongues and dialects too. Fraser says, "As to the Spanish speech or language, it varies more than the tongue of any country, that which is common to them all. The vulgar Castilian Spanish, which by reason of its affinity and consonancy with the Latin, the Spaniards call their language Romany. In Granada and Andalusia, the Arabic and Moorish language is much in use still. In Catalonia, Valencia, Portugal, had a great mixture of the French because of their trade and negotiation. The high countries bordering on the Pyrenees and Cantabrian Ocean have still retained much of the language of the Spaniard and Goths." There's nothing really original in this, but he's interested. In what would become a typical fashion, Spain gave him an opportunity to draw on his experience as a native speaker of what we would call today a minority language. Although he didn't visit Biscay and his stay in Spain was fleeting, Fraser was fascinated by Basque or Biscayan, believing it to, quote, be much like our British and Welsh language, unquote. Now, moving eastwards, he has a great conversation with a vomiting skipper while heading across a rough sea towards Genoa, his class. This individual was something akin to the linguister accounted for by John Gallagher, kind of linguistic broker. Fraser tells us he switched to a very fair, plain, smooth style of Latin to ease their interactions. I'm sure he did. While a growing knowledge of Italian helped Fraser immediately following that. The potential obstacles of Hungarian, I've come across those, and Slavonic fascinated him more than they troubled him. And the challenges they posed may have again been eased by his conversational Latin, still a language that was relatively common parlance in that part of Europe. In the section of the memoir on Hungary, Fraser's detail is remarkable, and it compares highly favourably with that provided by other English-speaking contemporary visitors to East Central Europe. Vines Morrison, James Howell, Paul Riker, Edward Brown. Fraser spends a paragraph noting key phrases in Hungarian before commenting on, quote, the High Dutch being generally spoken there among the scholars, soldiers and merchants. Makes a lot of more subtle points, such as that there were many Slavic speakers within the Magyar realms and towards the Ottoman frontier, concluding, quote, there remains a dialect of the Scythian speech among them still, but among the better sort and men, since the Slavonian language is generally spoken, written and printed, as in Transylvania, Moldavia and Poland, that keep the Roman character. On the Ottoman Empire, language was again to the fore in his claim that, quote, their divinity and law is taught in Slavonic, but the vulgar speak Tartarian, which is the common Turkish language. Fraser admired a copy of the Quran, but he didn't actually enter the Ottoman lands, turning north instead through northeastern Hungary, what's now Slovakia, where he concluded that the everyday language was a dialect of the Scythian, but again, amongst the better sort, the Slavonian language is generally spoken, written and printed. This is not typical. He's writing much more about these languages than just about any other traveller from the Stuart Kingdoms. Fraser's return route westwards began at this point. In Prague, he took an interest in its bilingual, Slavonic and German character, the city giving him a chance to switch between numerous speech domains while visiting, in his estimation, the upwards of 50 fathers then present in the city's Irish Franciscan College. The friars were fluent in Czech, as was evident when Fraser heard a Father Brian preach in the Slavonian tongue, seems to be his generic term, with his great volubility as the natives and with the applause of all his hearers. Fraser's effusive description of his communication with the Irish friars and his admiration for their linguistic skills once again suggests a connection with his Gaelic background. His route eventually led Fraser towards the United Provinces of the Northern Netherlands. The local language became slightly more familiar to him here, with Fraser showing some knowledge of Dutch near Utrecht, where he encountered a woman at her nacht oven, for so the Dutch call a baking oven. Once in Utrecht, the reader encounters further evidence of his enthusiasm for languages in his encounter with Anna Maria van Schoorlen, who's often claimed to be the first female university student in Europe. Fraser saw her worshipping in the English church there and commented that she has now at length come to proficiency and perfection in all the Oriental original languages, that she is exactly mistress of the Hebrew, Chaldaic, Syriac, Greek, Latin, Arabic, High Dutch and Slavonic, besides the common speaker of Spanish, Italian, French, English, Danish and Swedish tongues. Everyone admires her. It hadn't taken foreign travel for Fraser to learn about her. He says that her fame had spread as far as the north of Scotland when I was a student in the King's College of Aberdeen, when a Mr. Andrew Cant had, according to him, dedicated his thesis to her. I can't find anything for that thesis. Interesting. In the Spanish Netherlands, Fraser experienced a final revealing multilingual spoken encounter on the place he called the Sandy Road just before Mons. He came across two men on horseback who asked in French what his nationality was, then which part of Scotland he was from, and eventually which parish he came from and what his surname was. Because this eventually produced an emotive response, either in Gaelic or Scots from the interrogator, of John Mackenzie of Little Findons on the Black Isle, less than 10 miles away from Fraser's home. Mackenzie told him that he'd been a soldier in Tangiers, but was now a lieutenant in the Spanish army going for Brussels, in his words. Gave him some money and arranged for Fraser to meet a Miss Leslie, a Scottish nun in the city, presumably a Scots speaker from the Catholic Northeast branch of that family. From there, Fraser headed on to France, with little further comment on language, to London, Gravesend, and finally by sea again to Scotland and the Firthlands. While his travel had opened him up to new languages, his curiosity to comprehend the voices he heard and his ability to code switch were in no way new. As had been shown, he displayed a remarkable openness to speaking in a multiplicity of languages throughout his life, whether these were the everyday Scots Gaelic or Scots of his local parish, presbytery and synod, or the ever more complex linguistic encounters to be experienced at grammar school and university or while travelling. So in the last part of the talk, I'm going to talk about the written word. Talked about his spoken abilities. He was a great writer. Well, great, and he wrote a lot. As has been shown, Fraser conveyed on his tour an unusual level of fascination in national and regional tongues that went beyond that of nearly all other grand tourists. But this openness cannot be explained simply on the basis of him having an ear for languages. Almost certainly he benefited from the use of a conversation manual. What John Gallagher has defined as a bi or multilingual text, which usually included some material on pronunciation, orthography, vocabulary and grammar, and had at its heart material that mimicked speech and could be employed in conversation by the reader. Conveniently, these were wee books. They were like, maybe a bit bigger than a smartphone, but not much bigger. So quite handy if you're wearing pilgrim's garb, as Fraser was. They were sometimes pocket-sized, and in the case of one of the classics of the type, the Thesaurus Polyglottus, essential text from 1603, provided coverage of all the languages Fraser cited in his travel memoirs. The aforementioned Gayard had recommended too that when it came to languages, the engagement of a traveller should be a scholarly one, so that he, and it probably was just he, could be, quote, capable of improving himself out of all books written in several tongues, as well as being able to speak them. Evidently, by the time of his return home, Fraser had collected and written down phrases, and probably also tackled some texts in terms of reading in French, Italian, German, Slavonic, Hungarian, Czech, and Dutch. This foregrounding an adeptness with reading and writing languages which went back to his childhood. Fraser was an intellectual. Bible study, schooling in Inverness, and university days in Aberdeen had given him a reading as much as a spoken knowledge of Latin, some Greek, and possibly some Hebrew. In most of his career, however, the evidence suggests that Latin was the only ancient language he wrote in, and that the bulk of his reading and writing was in a combination of Gaelic and English. Next slide, please. Embedded within his Wardlaw manuscript is a, quote, catalogue of manuscripts being books bound, written and held by Master James Fraser, Pastor Montes Mariae, in diverse volumes at anno 1660. Compiled towards the end of his life, it lists 53 titles, volumes Fraser owned, comprising many of his own works, along with copies of pieces written by others. And I think it shows the interconnected nature of his reading and writing in and translation between these key languages. Now, you can't see that on the slide here, but on the list you have an Irish dictionary in 4 quartos and Hibernologia, a volume of Irish verse. In these two, we have illuminating evidence that Fraser's interest in Gaelic went beyond the oral aspects covered earlier to the linguistic and literary. Wider evidence supporting the continued relevance in Scotland of classical Gaelic, which I mentioned before, is seen in the Book of Clanranald and several other texts. John Carslaw's translation at the behest of the Synod of Argyll of the Book of Common Order had occasioned the appearance of the language's first printed publication in 1567. I could go on, but effectively there are publications coming out in the 17th century in classical Gaelic in Scotland. The Bible comes through the work of Robert Kirk, Episcopalian minister of Balwhidder in Perthshire, who in 1684 published the first full metrical psalter in the language, while 1690 saw the publication of the Gaelic text of the Old and New Testament, using for the first time Roman characters. Nevertheless, Manuas MacKinnish has accounted for the simultaneous rise of a vernacular Gaelic in Scotland. The Book of the Dean of Lismore, the Fernig manuscript, for example, what was becoming a move towards a literary Scots Gaelic, a shift which gradually led, as did its growing dominance in speech, to the extinguishing of the common form. In terms of reading and writing, Fraser knew both forms of Gaelic and negotiated between them, with MacKinnish arguing that Fraser was, quote, well aware of traditional Gaelic orthographic practices, but much more comfortable with the Scots form. And this included Scots spelling practices, which he relied on in his work. Next slide, please. Well, Fraser's interests in classical Gaelic are evident in a gift of his to the Inverness Presbyterial Library, the first borough library in the north of mainland Scotland, founded in 1706. And boy, would James Fraser be happy about that. He complains throughout his adult life about the lack of books in the Highlands, which by libraries is much better than the library. Fraser donated his copy of the Church of Ireland, Bishop William Beadle's first translation of the Old Testament, to that nascent library. And this work had been completed originally circa 1635-6 and published following financial assistance from Robert Boyle, Earl of Cork, in 1685 as a Protestant endeavour. Nothing unique in this. Fraser's copy of Beadle's Classical Gaelic Bible was one of many sent to Scotland in the years before 1700, and a text which remained unintelligible to most Scottish Gaels due to its Irish font. Yet, as has been seen, Fraser was interested in vernacular Scots Gaelic, not just for speech, but in a scholarly sense too. The extent of his knowledge becomes abundantly clear in the fragments of an exchange from 1699, a letter sent to him by Welsh scholar Edward Lloyd. While it's not been proven possible to ascertain how Lloyd had come to know of Fraser, the letter, addressed to the Reverend Mr. James Fraser, Minister of Kirkhill in the Air near Inverness, shows how Fraser could rival his well-known Gaelic-speaking contemporary Martin Martin in the scholarly circles of Edinburgh and London as an informant on Gaelic. Lloyd's desire for knowledge from his contact in Kirkhill extended to, quote, what he called the old Scottish language and customs, the comparing of which with the Welsh, Cornish and Armorican is one part of my design. On the list of Lloyd's requests to Fraser were, this is where it gets a bit demanding, an interpretation of the nouns in Mr. Ray's Dictionariolum Trilinguae, with the addition of the verbs and adjectives in the vulgar nomenclatura into the Northern Ersh would be very acceptable, which we would. A catalogue of the towns, castles, villages, mountains, vales, lochs and rivers within 10 or 20 miles, with an interpretation of such of these names as are intuitively intelligible, and queries or conjectures about some of the others. Thank you. Lloyd went on to ask Fraser to provide more. A catalogue of the Highland poets, note, and all of the other writers on that subject, so ever in the Ersh or Irish or Scottish Irish. Yeah, because it's Scottish Irish. When they flourished, what they read, how large the works, with the 3 or 4 initial and final words, and where the works may be seen at present. A catalogue of the Christian names, purely Ersh, with a mark of distinction to those still in use. Just a basic request. The focus on Ray's 1675 dictionary in English, Latin and Greek, and from there on both classical and Scots Gaelic grammar, toponymy, onomastics and poetry, indicates the assumed breadth of Fraser's knowledge. Lloyd gave him several months to work on his research, thankfully, and evidently expected his Highland informant would collaborate with other local experts in collating it. Sadly, Fraser's intellectual considerations as regards the Scots language are much, much harder to detect, and overshadowed by his intellectual engagement with English and Latin, if we go by his catalogue of manuscripts. But in the Firth lands too, one sees an ongoing educated written Scots, in, for example, the 16th and 17th century borough records that I mentioned. Indeed, given Fraser's connections to Elgin and to Murray, the relative lack of Scots words in his own extant writing is actually very striking and a bit of a linguistic puzzle to me. Fraser's surviving work, while it's ripe for harvesting in terms of its references to language, is in a Scots-influenced English, which we have to conclude, I suppose, reflects his reading background in the latter language and his wish to reach a much wider readership. Quite who they are, I don't know. The lack of material in the broad Scots that he knew from early childhood, and which in the eastern parts of the Diocese of Murray remained the lingua franca and the major language of writing, remains to be explained. Okay, a few conclusions. As Eric Durstler has argued, modern historians tend to project 19th century and subsequent ideas of linguistic nationalism onto early modern practices. This has always been more challenging for historians of Scotland, where the debate, equally fraught though it is, tends to assume Scotland's major medieval languages to have been Gaelic and Scots, with English emerging gradually into the mainstream from the Reformation onwards towards the dominance it has today. Nevertheless, Durstler's points are valid for northeastern parts of Scotland and for the North Sea more broadly. As he puts it, instead of, quote, demarcating stark boundaries between speech communities, historians should be looking at language and thinking of it as, quote, existing in linguistically mixed zones, where code switching is and was rather a normal and valuable skill. Next slide, please. This plaque dedicated to Fraser was put up in Kirkhill Parish. We don't have a portrait of him, though he had red hair, I can tell you that. But it mentions him as a linguist, so that's something. Put in Scottish terms, and assuming a firm Highland and Lowland divide, with the former considered to be a monolingual Gaelic and the latter monolingual Scots, is a mistake. A mosaic of languages was a feature in parts of the Highlands, as it was in other rural coastal areas of early modern Europe. There is much that appears fleeting in James Fraser's biography, but its multilingual nature does not. Multilingualism was an aspect of Fraser's life before, during, and after his travels, to a much greater extent than it was perhaps for many others, even from the Stuart kingdoms. Through him and the other polyglot scholars of the Firth lands, we have an addition of their own blend of ingredients to the North Sea linguistic melting pot. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you very much, David. That was a really fascinating talk that I'm sure has raised many questions in your minds. I know it has in mine. I should have said at the start, and I forgot to say, my apologies for that, that if there are any questions, if you could please put them in the chat. We will field them like that rather than get people to call them out. So now is the time. If you have anything to ask, just pop something in the chat, and we'll deal with them.
Deal with them sounds a bit different.
Whilst people are doing that, David, perhaps I could ask something just to get us going. I was intrigued by the date on the plaque, raised by public subscription in 1908.
Oh, 1908. Sorry, I said 1905. I got the mistake.
Perhaps, yeah. And it just made me wonder, what was his afterlife? If in the early 20th century, folks are subscribing to raising a tribute to him in his church, what was his afterlife?
It's a really good question, and he disappears into obscurity for quite a long time. I mentioned the two major manuscripts, they're the major sources, the history of the Frasers and his travel account. And the history of the Frasers remained relatively well known. The Inverness Courier occasionally showed an interest in it. And Malcolm Bangor-Jones has a really great story about this, actually, but I'll maybe leave that for Malcolm to hear if he wants. but it re-emerges very much in 1905 because that's when the Scottish History Society volume, Chronicles of the Frasers, comes out, and that's edited by William Mackay, who's a local scholar. So I'm sure that that inspired the local community at Kirkhill 3 years later, which is interesting because it makes you wonder to what extent there was an oral, a cultural memory of Fraser in that community.
Yeah, very much.
Because he was such a Ken Speckle figure. And there's a lot of the mausoleum that you saw in one of the slides, that's a 1633 construction. So there's physical material culture evidence in that community. So relatively well known as an historian and a traveller, a bit obscure, sorry, as an historian, as a traveller, utterly unknown. And this is that the Triennial Travels manuscript, several 100,000 words in length, it just disappeared for, it goes into private hands at a certain point, but it's very hard to trace until the 1960s, 70s. It reappears at the University of Aberdeen special collections, and it's been used by a very small number of people since then. But it's a gem.
It's a fascinating story, isn't it? I think we've now got some questions. So shall I call that? Right, we'll start with Ian Cameron. Ian, thank you very much for this question. Actually, that was going to be one of mine as well. And Ian asks, what inspired Fraser to make his journey in the first place? And what was the mechanics of it? How long did it take?
He says it on page 1, and I know I haven't described it. He says islanders are lost and often need in foreign travel, and particularly people from these islands. It's a very interesting comment. Curiosity as well. That's what he claims. Let's not trust Fraser completely. It's deeply valuable, all of this stuff, and I would never ever suggest it wasn't, but it's just the sheer wealth of material that is so valuable for us. I've often thought he may be a spy, because how else would you so easily get the pass of the Cromwellian authorities? And why would a Protestant go to southern Europe and pass as a Catholic pilgrim? He's very peculiar about when he comes back to London, which is just at the time of the Restoration, about his behaviour there. There's a lot of dissimulation. As I say, he's a trickster. I'm not dismissing him because of that, but we all have complex biographies. In his case, that's evident. That's what I find fascinating about him. That's why I find his inaccurate accounts really interesting. Doesn't put me off them. And people often say, well, that can't have been the case. But the fact he remembers it and writes it down is part of the whole, absolutely, the fascination. I'm not really answering the question. The mechanics of it, well, in one sense, he expects a lot in terms of hospitality. That's the Highland part of his personality. He'll provide hospitality, but he also expects it. And he says he doesn't decide to be a pilgrim until he gets to Dieppe, and he arranges the release of his English co-traveller Henry Jordan from jail there, and they both decide to travel on foot. Until that point, he's on horseback, and he was a good horseman. But he gets really fed up with that in England and just said, in fact, his horse dies sadly somewhere around Doncaster. And from then on, he's a bit scunnered with the idea of travelling on horseback. So he decides to go on foot. And he kind of thinks he's going to get away without cash, but he can't quite manage that. So he has to get hold of it. So he relies a heck of a lot on hospitality. He stays in hospitals sometimes. They weren't quite what we would think of as hospitals. They also provided accommodation for poor people. But he also stays with other people called Fraser, other Highlanders, other Scots, and he makes the most of that. This is the peak period of Scottish migration to continental Europe, and also Irish migration. So he comes across Scottish, Irish, and English people everywhere. Every single place almost he stays in. So the mechanics, other than that, he's a chancer, I suppose. I don't know. He just gets by. And he's not wealthy. Don't have the impression, if I've given it, that this is somebody who's going with a silver spoon. He's not, but he gets by.
I mean, you do call him a grand tourist
at
one point, and to in my limited imagination, grand tourists are wealthy, are the upper echelons of society. But is he therefore a particular type of grand Tour?
That's so interesting because we don't have another word really other than educational travellers, grand tourist.
Sojourner, I suppose.
Yeah, that conveys to me something similar to a grand tourist. I only mean a grand tourist in the sense that he travels a lot and is ambitious. One thing that is slightly skewed in the historiography on the grand tour is the kind of obsession with Rome. I mean, he does spend a lot of time in Rome, but he's very fascinated by other places too. Yeah, I think that's really a good question. I would critique the idea of him as a grand tourist as well, but I don't really have an alternative framework to put him in. And I think he just needs to be placed in there as an awkward example of this, and people can find that out and describe what else should he be referred to? I mean, I think he has a fair amount of social capital. He considers himself possibly by that point as the sheriffy of the Frasers, who he refers to as a clan throughout. But he's not a minister at that point. He has a Master of Arts from Aberdeen University. That gives him some capital as well. His linguistic skills help him get around. But he's not wealthy in the material sense. No, but he doesn't bring that money on his travels. He's constantly scrimping and saving. Like in Prague, he gets some pears and he's just so delighted. It's like he hasn't eaten for 3 days. He's like, got the most delicious pears I've ever had.
That's really interesting. We have another interesting question taking us back to the plaque from Nisbet there. Do you know what the Gaelic quote is on the plaque?
Yeah, I'm not going to read it in Gaelic because it would be really bad, but it translates as, "He was a man who came, saw and revealed what he saw." Something like that. That's a really bad translation of it. But I don't know the origins of it. If there's a story behind that, that would be really good to know. I've never quite figured that one out. I think it's quite a good quote. But really interesting, wouldn't it? It would be interesting to know why the community in Kirkhill decided to choose that. What they don't list on that plaque is that he was an historian, and that frustrates me because I think he was evidently a very important historian.
Fascinating. There's still opportunities, colleagues, for questions. If anybody has any more, just pop them in the chat. But Nicola, I see you are waving, so fire away.
Yes, the disembodied voice. Yeah, I just wanted to ask about the Dutch connection. You mentioned the Dutch people as being the only ones who had that sort of saving, or who tended to speak in English, or not tended to, but actually would speak in English, compared to other parts of Europe where they wouldn't have that. And I wondered if there was any particular reason for that. Is it through trade, or is it just?
I'm not an expert on that, but I suppose there are the connections through East Anglia, and linguistically Dutch is quite close to English anyway. I mean, there's a Dutch church in London, so there's cultural exchange in that way. There are a lot of interactions between the Dutch part of the Low Countries and England and Scotland, of course. But I don't really have a good answer for that. But it's much easier for a Dutch person to learn English than it is for a French person or a Spaniard, I think, in general. And that probably is what is suggested. But when he says Dutch, he probably has a wider meaning of the term than we have. It probably means a Low German speaker.
Thank you. So we haven't had any other questions out there in VC land. We're drawing towards your final opportunity for asking any questions. Anything coming up? Okay, well, I'm sure David will be very willing to answer anything by email if anything pops up into your mind, after this talk. I think we'll bring it to a close now, though. Thank you very much. It just remains for me to say that, as I said at the beginning of this is the first of our new season of talks, and our next talk takes place on October the 13th. I'm hoping very much that it's not an unlucky date, as I'm one of the speakers for those talks, along with Professor Marjorie Harper of the Centre for History and, of course, of Aberdeen University. And that talk is a co-badged talk with the Highland Archaeology Festival. It's on the project. Marjorie and I have currently working with the Islair Centre out there on Lewis, looking at the collective memory, shall we say, of coping with the Islair disaster. So I hope it intrigues people, and you know, that you're interested in joining us for that next talk on the 13th, again at 5:30 p.m. And again, that can be or that will be a hybrid talk. So that is online and here in the Boroughfield in Dornoch at the Centre for History in person. So that's it for now. Thank you very much for your attendance, everybody. We hope to see you again sometime. And all it remains to do is thank David for his very interesting talk. Thank you very much. Thank you and goodbye.